This month at Manor Park Classics we have a Ford Sierra XR4i, the short-lived first hot Sierra from 1983-84, which wasn't all that popular, but then again, neither was the Sierra in this period. You see, we remember the Sierra today as this icon of the 1980s, but in its first few years, its life looked to be rocky. You see, Ford had dominated this big family car segment in the UK ever since the early 1960s when they first introduced the Cortina. Now in Europe, they'd never quite had the same level of success with the Taunus, the Cortina and Taunus of which later kind of coalesced into one mainstream production line with the last generation of both cars. But let's look at this from a British perspective, because I am British, and the thing British people do best is take an Anglo-centric view of the world. So let's do that for a second and look at this through the eyes of Ford UK, who for 20 years had had enormous success with the Cortina. It had been Britain's best-selling car for however many years, alongside its smaller sibling, the Escort. But with the final generation of Cortina, which was introduced in 1975, things weren't quite looking so rosy anymore. Yes, it was still enormously successful, but it was starting to lose ground, and people were stopping seeing the attraction to it. The original Cortinas, the first three, shall we say, were incredibly desirable cars. This was when Ford had their act together and produced cars that people wanted. Even if they weren't incredibly sophisticated mechanically, people wanted them and they were simple, so fleet managers wanted them as well. And that golden mixture led to Ford's dominance in the segment. In fact, Ford became the largest manufacturer in the UK primarily because of the Cortina. Yet in that late 70s period, they were looking to try and find their mojo again, to try and find what it was about the Mark IV and Mark V Cortinas that weren't quite there anymore. In 1982, therefore, they came up with the Sierra. This car was styled in Germany. It was really, as was the last Cortina to be honest, but in terms of a real, quite radical project, it was one of the first Ford of Europe coveralls. It was styled by Ewa Barnson, and this, the styling, is what separated the Sierra from everything else. As I mentioned just a minute ago, part of what made the Cortina great was its simplicity. People wanted them, they were reliable, they were very, very cheap to run, and so Ford didn't want to mess here. In 1976-77, Ford introduced the Mark I Fiesta, which was their first modern transverse engine front drive car. They then followed that up in 1980 with the Mark III Escort, again front wheel drive. But for the real mass market car, they wanted to just hold back a little bit. They kept the Sierra rear wheel drive, although it did sit on a fundamentally new platform. Coil springs all round and no live rear axle at the back anymore, but still it was rear wheel drive, something people understood and they weren't scared of. What possibly was going to scare people, however, was this styling. It's here to be as aerodynamic as possible. That was the goal of the Sierra, not only to make it actually aerodynamic, but also to make it look rakish and aerodynamic and ultra modern, and that is exactly what this shape does, with that famous grille-less aero-shaped front end. And of course at the back, this being an XR4, it has the twin wings on it as well. Also, that B-pillar or C-pillar shape technically, right through the back. It's just such a rakish looking car from Ford, who over the past 10 years from this have been producing very conservative looking big family saloon cars. This car, however, was then christened the Jelly Mold. People were shocked by its appearance back in 1982. They just weren't sure what to make of the Sierra. And so in its first few years, people got cold feet. The very conservative market that Ford had built and dominated for itself was now gawping at this new car, and it forced Ford to introduce the Orion, which was a saloon 3-box shaped version of the new Escort, which of course was front-wheel drive. This is a true changing of the guards from the old rear drive live axle 3-box saloon towards this aero shape and front wheel drive, although not in this car's case, and hatchback of course, most importantly. But this was Ford doing their best to get back to that point where they were in the early 1970s. And the reason they really had to do that in the UK is because Vauxhall were catching up. In 1976, they introduced the Cavalier. Its Opel equivalent on the continent was the Ascona. And over those few years, the Cavalier really started eating into the Cortina's sales. In 1981, the year before the Sierra was introduced, they brought out the Mark II Cavalier with front-wheel drive. So that was really the car that the Sierra had to beat, and I'm afraid it didn't. In 1984, the Cavalier drew level with the Sierra and previously Cortina, and from then on it was neck and neck through the rest of the 1980s. The Sierra, should I say, didn't take Ford back into that place of market domination. However, people did eventually grow to like the aero shape. The XR4i that we have here was introduced in 1983, as I said, as the first hot Sierra. And it's a shame for this car that it's coexisted with that period where people weren't so sure about the Sierra. It was only later when they did the XR4x4 and of course the RS Cosworth that people really started to like the Sierra just as a normal family car, never mind as a performance version. So the Sierra had a slow start for Ford, but it ended up living for 11 years through to 1993 when it was replaced by the front-wheel drive, of course, Mondeo. But this being the XR4, it has the 2.8 litre Cologne V6 in the front, a proper engine, rather than your turbocharged four-cylinder nonsense of your wonderfully engineered Cosworths. I jest, of course, but this is a rare car, and I've never driven a Sierra before, so let's see what it's about and see what the Ford Brigade really like about these. So mechanically, the Sierra was quite traditional, and of course, it had to meet the needs of a large family car from the early 1980s, so it's very comfortable. It is a lovely, soft suspension setup, and with rear drive platforms, Ford had so many years worth of experience at this point that it was difficult to assume they weren't going to do a good job of it. And indeed, they did. The Sierra ended up being such a good racing car because it just had a fundamentally good platform to start with. So this car turns in really nicely. It actually feels smaller than it is. By modern standards, it's not a huge car, but even by the standards of the day, it feels smaller. It shrinks around you, this car, because it has a brilliant agility. And also one thing which isn't quite up the agenda of a performance motorist, but for family use, the fact it had a rear drive platform means it was easier to park because it's got a better turning circle. It's all the little things, isn't it, that really matter. But being the XR4i, this has that lovely burbly V6. I like turbocharged engines. My comment a minute ago, yeah, it's just a joke, but I like naturally aspirated engines. They're just freer, and clearly they feel less stressed. The old Cologne V6 is an overhead valve engine. It's not especially modern, but that means that it suits a family car. It doesn't rev all that hard. Instead, it just delivers a beautifully torquey power output right from the get-go. So that's what I think in 1983-84 most people viewed this car as, because though this was the first hot Sierra, the first of many as it happened, there wasn't an out-and-out hot version, in the UK at least, of the last Cortina. That was a thing preserved for that is a really lovely engine, that Cologne V6. I like it a lot. But that's the preserve of the Mark II Cortina, with the likes of the Lotus Cortina, that just wasn't present for so many years. So another part of the Sierra getting its mojo back was in giving it a hot version. Even if these first versions weren't that popular, it more than paid off in the end. What a fantastic noise it makes. So if you're interested in owning a bit of 1980s brilliant history, then please do head over to our website and have a look for yourself.